The year was 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, an unforgiving battleground where every wave seemed to echo the cries of war. The Empire of Japan had unleashed its famed Mitsubishi Zero fighters across the skies for years, striking fear into Allied pilots with their speed, agility, and deadly precision. For many, the Zero was seen as untouchable, a ghost in the clouds, a predator circling its prey. But by mid-war, a storm was building, and that storm carried the insignia of the United States. On a humid dawn, with the sun rising like fire over the horizon, fleets of American carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft into the sky. The hum of engines roared like thunder across the Pacific. Pilots strapped in, eyes cold with determination, knowing this would not be an ordinary battle. It would be the test of dominance in the air. A clash of wings, where only one side could prevail. What followed was a spectacle of chaos and destruction. Squadrons of Japanese Zeros rose to meet the challenge, their formation sharp, their intent unshaken. But they were not prepared for the relentless storm descending upon them. The U.S. fighters cut through the skies like steel hawks, faster, deadlier, and more disciplined than ever before. The balance of power shifted in a matter of hours, and what had once been Japan's greatest weapon was reduced to burning wreckage across the ocean. This was not just a battle, it was the breaking of a legend. The day when hundreds of Zeros were destroyed in a single assault, forever changing the course of air superiority in the Pacific theater. The assault began in the first pale light of dawn, when the sky still held the hushed tones of night, but promised the blazing sun that would soon dominate the Pacific horizon. From the decks of massive American carriers, the air seemed alive with anticipation. Pilots stood ready, helmets strapped tight, oxygen masks checked, eyes fixed ahead with a calm that belied the storm they were about to unleash. Below them, deck crews rushed in precise coordination, fueling planes, arming them with belts of ammunition, rockets, and bombs. Every movement was rehearsed. Every command barked with urgency, for they all knew what awaited beyond the endless stretch of ocean. This was not merely another sortie. This was the beginning of a blow that would shake Japan's air supremacy to its very core. Engines roared as the first squadrons were ordered into the skies. The rumble began as a low vibration across the deck, then rose into a full-throated thunder as propellers tore at the morning air. Waves of Grumman F-6F Hellcats, sleek and powerful, surged forward in formation. Each aircraft carried the emblem of the United States on its wings, and behind those insignias flew pilots who had been trained relentlessly, sharpened by months of combat, and hardened by the losses of earlier years when the Zero had ruled the skies. Now the tide had shifted. Now the Americans carried not only numbers, but superiority in technology, tactics, and intelligence. The carrier commanders had plotted every movement down to the second. Radar stations had already spotted Japanese squadrons forming. The trap was set, and the Americans were ready to spring it. As the Hellcats climbed into the heavens, the rising sun glared against their fuselages, painting them in streaks of fire and steel. The sight was awe-inspiring. Endless squadrons rising in disciplined formations, stretching across the sky like a living wall of wings and engines. The Pacific sky, once dominated by swift and nimble Japanese fighters, was now filled with the grinding power of American machinery. The air vibrated with their collective presence, and even from far below on the carriers, sailors stared upward in awe, realizing they were witnessing something monumental, the unleashing of a storm greater than any yet seen in this theater of war. Far ahead, the Japanese Zeros rose to meet them. Their silver bodies cut through the blue with elegant precision, their formation sharp and fearless. For years, the Zero had been a symbol of dominance, its agility unmatched, its turning radius capable of outmaneuvering any enemy plane. Japanese pilots carried with them a near-spiritual confidence in their machines, a pride born from victories in the early years of the war. But this morning was different. They did not yet know it, but they were flying headlong into a storm that would break their legend. The first clash erupted with terrifying speed. The American squadrons dived with ruthless precision, their superior altitude giving them the advantage. Guns thundered, streaks of tracers cutting across the sky in fiery arcs. The Zeros scattered, breaking formation to evade the initial strike, twisting and rolling in desperate maneuvers that had once given them the edge. But the Hellcats stayed with them, their more powerful engines allowing them to climb, dive, and recover faster than the Japanese had anticipated. Bullets tore into fragile Zero fuselages, engines burst into flames, and trails of black smoke streaked downward into the ocean below. What had once been a predator's dance was turning into a slaughter. The Japanese counterattack came swiftly. Swarms of Zeros regrouped and lunged back into the fight, their pilots determined to uphold their reputation as the fiercest air warriors of the Pacific. Dogfights erupted in every direction, spiraling duels of life and death, where victory was measured in fractions of a second. Yet even in these close encounters, the Americans showed their growing dominance. They did not chase recklessly into the Zeros' traps, as they once had. They held discipline, covering each other, attacking with coordination and precision. One American fighter would draw a Zero into a climb, only for another to swoop in from the side and unleash a devastating burst of gunfire. The Japanese pilots fought valiantly, but the tactics that had once brought them glory were now being methodically dismantled. From the ground, the battle must have looked like chaos incarnate, streaks of light, trails of smoke and machines tumbling from the sky in flames. But within that chaos, the Americans moved with deadly rhythm. Radar operators aboard the carriers relayed constant updates, directing squadrons toward concentrations of enemy planes, ensuring the battle remained in their favor. This technological edge, combined with sheer numbers, turned the sky into a trap from which the Zeros could not escape. For every American plane that fell, several Japanese fighters went down in fire and smoke. One by one, Japanese formations were broken. Once tight and disciplined, they fragmented under the relentless American assault. Zeros found themselves isolated, forced into duels where their agility could not save them against the heavier firepower of the Hellcats. Explosions bloomed across the skies like fiery blossoms, and each one marked the fall of a legend. The ocean beneath became a graveyard of steel, as burning wreckage plunged downward, crashing into the waves with plumes of water and smoke. The Pacific, so serene only hours before, was now littered with the remnants of a battle that was tilting irrevocably toward American dominance. Still, the Zeros kept coming. Japanese pilots threw themselves into the fight with almost reckless determination, driven by duty, by honor, by the hope that sheer willpower might turn the tide. They soared into impossible climbs, dove headlong into American formations, even attempted ramming maneuvers when their guns ran empty. But courage alone could not match the crushing weight of American firepower and tactics. Time and again, their efforts ended in flames. Their once mighty planes reduced to falling shadows against the endless expanse of sea and sky. For the American pilots, the realization of victory came gradually. In the moments between engagements, when they looked around and saw more enemy smoke trails than friendly, their radios crackled with updates of kills, their formations reassembled with fewer gaps than their opponents. They knew they were winning, not just the battle, but the war for the skies. Each Zero that fell was not just a plane destroyed, but a piece of Japan's air supremacy torn away forever. By the height of the assault, the sky itself seemed aflame. Explosions erupted in every direction, gunfire rattled endlessly, and black smoke rose in thick columns across the horizon. The pilots pressed on without hesitation, executing maneuver after maneuver, their discipline unshaken by the chaos surrounding them. Every dive, every burst of fire, every climb carried with it the weight of history. They were not just fighting men. They were instruments of a strategy designed to break the enemy's will, to shatter the legend of the Zero once and for all. The assault stretched on, a grinding clash that left no doubt as to who now owned the skies. American formations remained tight, their losses minimal compared to the devastation wrought upon their foes. The Japanese Zeros, so long feared and revered, were being destroyed by the hundreds, their dominance vanishing in the space of a single day. The balance of power had shifted permanently, and the Pacific would never be the same. And as the last waves of Japanese fighters faltered, as smoke and fire filled the horizon, the Americans pressed forward with relentless determination. This was not just victory. It was supremacy, written in fire across the skies of the Pacific. The legend of the Zero, born of fear and triumph, had met its end in a storm of steel and flame. Japanese pilots fought with a ferocity that was both admirable and tragic, their resolve unbroken even as the skies filled with the thunder of American firepower. From the cockpits of their Zeros, they saw not only enemy aircraft, but the embodiment of a threat to their homeland, their honor, and the empire they had sworn to defend. Each man knew the risks. Each understood that the odds were stacked against them. Yet still they climbed into the chaos, pushing their planes into impossible dives, threading through bursts of machine gun fire. Determined to fight until the last bullet or the last breath, the dogfights that erupted were battles within battles, isolated duels, fought amidst the vastness of the Pacific sky. A Zero would twist into a roll, desperately trying to shake off an American Hellcat locked on its tail. Another would climb in a sudden burst of speed, hoping to gain altitude and turn the advantage. Yet every maneuver, every desperate attempt was met with an answer. The Americans had learned. They had studied the Zero's strengths, dissected its weaknesses, and trained their pilots to counter them. What once seemed like invincible agility now became predictable patterns. The Hellcats exploited every hesitation, every turn, until the Zeros were trapped in webs of overlapping fire. The imbalance of numbers made every duel even more punishing. For every Zero that managed to claw its way into a position of advantage, 3 or 4 American fighters appeared from above or the side, guns blazing, tearing through thin aluminum and fuel tanks with merciless precision. Explosions erupted mid-air as planes were shredded to pieces, sending fragments spiraling downward. The ocean below began to shimmer with the reflection of flames as more and more wreckage plunged into its depths. The once pristine waters now boiled with fire, oil slicks spreading like black scars across the surface. But the Japanese pilots did not break. Their discipline and courage kept them in the fight, even as reality pressed in with merciless weight. They pressed their attacks again and again, sometimes scoring hits, sometimes sending American planes trailing smoke toward the sea. Each small victory was a flicker of resistance against an overwhelming tide. Yet the flickers were swallowed almost instantly by the storm. The Americans were too many, too well armed, and too well prepared. Their formations stayed intact, their communication tight, their attacks relentless. The battle spread across miles of sky, the horizon itself flickering with the light of combat. There were moments when the air seemed to thrum with pure chaos, dozens of planes crossing paths, tracers weaving like fiery threads through the air, the thunder of explosions blending into a single deafening roar. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending not just themselves, but the honor of their nation. Yet as the hours dragged on, desperation alone was not enough. Their losses mounted faster than they could bear, and the sight of Zero after Zero falling into the sea became a grim rhythm of defeat. From within their cockpits, American pilots could feel the shift in momentum. They pressed forward without hesitation, diving through clouds of smoke, tearing apart formations with calculated bursts of fire. Some spoke later of how it seemed unreal, like a vision out of nightmares, planes everywhere, explosions tearing through the sky. The sea below littered with the wreckage of what had once been the pride of Japan's Air Force. The once fabled Zero was being reduced to ash, its myth unraveling in real time. And yet, even in their crumbling numbers, the Japanese pilots did not flee. They turned back into the storm, again and again, until there was nothing left for them to give. Each loss was felt not only in numbers, but in spirit. The Zero had once been the sword of Japan, the terror of the Pacific skies. To see it fall in droves, consumed by fire and smoke, was to see the very symbol of their supremacy shattered. American pilots, too, felt the weight of the moment. They were not merely winning a battle. They were reshaping the air war itself. The myth of the untouchable Zero, the fear that had once haunted every Allied pilot, was burning away with every Japanese plane that plunged into the ocean. The sea itself bore silent witness to the destruction. Waves swallowed wreckage whole, oil fires raged across the surface, and debris floated aimlessly, broken wings, shattered fuselages, and sometimes the silent descent of parachutes that never reached safety. What had once been a battlefield in the sky became a graveyard below, where steel and fire sank into the depths. The contrast was staggering. The infinite blue of the ocean, so calm beyond the smoke, and the violent wreckage that stained it. By the middle of the assault, the Japanese pilots were outnumbered on every front. Their formations, once precise and unyielding, now fragmented into desperate clusters of survivors. They circled, dived, and climbed in vain attempts to regroup, but every motion brought another wave of American fighters crashing into them. Radios crackled with frantic voices, orders and pleas mingling in the chaos, but even communication could not hold them together. What remained of their fighting strength was being consumed minute by minute, shattered by a machine of war that was too vast to stop. And still, they fought. Some charged headlong into impossible odds, hoping to bring down even a single enemy before their own inevitable end. Some dove toward American formations with guns blazing, determined to go out in a blaze of fire. A few, when all else failed, even turned their planes into weapons, ramming into enemies with the last of their strength. These acts of desperation spoke to their courage, but also to the hopelessness of their cause. For every act of defiance, there were a dozen more losses, each one erasing another fragment of Japan's aerial might. From the decks of the American carriers, the scale of victory was becoming clear. Sailors and officers watched as flaming wrecks fell into the sea one after another, the skies gradually clearing of Japanese aircraft. Reports poured in over the radios, enemy squadrons destroyed, enemy formations broken, hundreds of planes lost. The Americans had not only survived the onslaught, they had annihilated it. Their pilots returned with confidence etched into their faces, their voices carrying the weight of triumph. They knew they had broken something far larger than a single force of Zeros. They had broken the very idea of Japanese air superiority. The Japanese homeland would hear of this loss, though perhaps not in full detail. But the impact would be undeniable. What had once been the sharpest weapon in Japan's arsenal had been dulled beyond repair in a single day of relentless combat. The Zero, once revered and feared, was now reduced to smoldering wrecks across the Pacific. The world was shifting, and the sky no longer belonged to Japan. The Americans, in contrast, felt the momentum of history pushing them forward. They had fought the predator and won. They had entered the heart of the storm and emerged as masters of the air. The path ahead was still long, still filled with battles and sacrifice, but the tide had turned. From this day, the legend of the Zero was no longer a symbol of terror. It was a relic of the past, consumed in fire and smoke beneath the unforgiving sun. When the last echoes of gunfire faded and the final smoke trails drifted into the morning sky, the scale of what had just happened became painfully clear. The Pacific, so vast and endless, now carried the scars of a battle unlike any seen before. The water was littered with fragments of burning steel, shattered wings, and blackened oil slicks that spread for miles. The smell of smoke and gasoline hung in the air, carried by the sea breeze. Above it all, the victorious hum of American squadrons lingered, their formations cutting a sharp contrast against the smoldering wreckage that floated beneath them. This was no ordinary victory. It was dominance, a brutal declaration that the skies of the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. For hours, the Americans pressed the advantage until there was nothing left to oppose them. Every wave of Japanese fighters had been thrown into the furnace of combat, and each wave had been consumed. The Zero, once the most feared predator of the air, now lay in pieces across the ocean. Hundreds destroyed in a single assault, a number so staggering that even the American pilots themselves found it difficult to comprehend. They had fought with everything they had, executing maneuvers with precision and unleashing firepower without hesitation, but it was the aftermath that revealed the magnitude of their triumph. Japan's aerial strength had not just been weakened, it had been shattered beyond recognition. From the American carriers, officers watched in silence as reports came in. One after another, the messages painted the same picture. Enemy forces obliterated, resistance broken, the sky cleared of threats. Sailors cheered, clapped, and embraced each other, but many simply stood in quiet awe at the scale of destruction. They had all witnessed smaller victories before, but nothing on this scale. What had unfolded before their eyes was a turning point, an event that would echo across the Pacific and beyond. For the first time in years, the shadow of the Zero was gone. The myth of its invincibility had been reduced to smoke drifting across the sea. In the cockpits of American planes, the pilots were both exhilarated and sobered. They had seen the faces of their enemy in the heat of dogfights, seen the desperate maneuvers, the courage, and the hopelessness in every clash. They had shot down planes by the dozens, yet with every kill, they understood they were dismantling more than a fleet, they were dismantling a legend. Each Zero that fell was a piece of history burning before their eyes. For many, the thought lingered. Years earlier, Allied pilots had feared this machine, whispered about its agility, and dreaded the encounters that seemed impossible to survive. But now, the tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted, and the American pilots felt the weight of that transformation pressing heavily on their shoulders. The Japanese losses went beyond the physical wreckage. What died that day was the aura of superiority, the psychological edge that had given Japanese pilots confidence and their enemies fear. The Zero had been the spearhead of Japanese air power, the weapon that had cut through skies from Pearl Harbor to the far reaches of the Pacific. To see it destroyed so completely, so quickly, was to see the heart of Japanese aerial supremacy ripped out. In the silence after the battle, the reality was unavoidable. The Zero would never again dominate the skies. Its era had ended in fire and ruin. As the sun began to descend toward the horizon, the battlefield took on an almost surreal appearance. Flames still burned on the surface of the ocean, painting the waves with orange reflections that stretched far into the distance. Debris floated aimlessly, the remnants of once proud machines now reduced to little more than twisted metal. Oil spread in black patches across the water, glistening under the fading light. And high above it all, American formations cruised back toward their carriers, wings steady, engines humming in unison. They flew not as survivors, but as conquerors, their silhouettes dark against the glowing backdrop of sunset. The day belonged to them, and the sky had been claimed. The Japanese homeland would feel the impact swiftly. News of the losses would reach commanders, and even with attempts to mask the full truth, the sheer scale could not be hidden. Hundreds of planes gone in a single day, along with countless experienced pilots. The blow was not just tactical, it was strategic, crippling Japan's ability to project air power across the Pacific. Where once they had relied on their fighters to protect fleets and territories, now they faced the harsh reality of decline. The skies that had once given them confidence now offered only the memory of defeat. For the United States, the victory meant more than numbers. It was proof that the long, grinding efforts of training, innovation, and sacrifice had borne fruit. It showed the world that America could not only stand against Japan, but overwhelm it, that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The destruction of the Zeros became a symbol of momentum, a sign that the tide of the war was moving toward its inevitable conclusion. Every pilot who returned to the deck of a carrier, every squadron that landed safely, carried with them not just the triumph of survival, but the knowledge that they had changed history. The Pacific had always been unforgiving, an ocean where distance, storms, and hidden dangers threatened every ship and plane. Yet on this day, it became a canvas for a story that would be told for generations. The battle was not just about tactics or machines. It was about resilience, adaptation, and the unshakable determination to break free from fear. The Zero had once defined the Pacific Air War, but its destruction defined its turning point. From this day forward, Japan would fight not from a position of strength, but from the shadow of its greatest loss. Silence eventually settled over the battlefield. The fires burned lower, the wreckage drifted farther, and the sounds of engines grew faint as American squadrons returned to base. The ocean, vast and indifferent, began to swallow the evidence of combat, pulling twisted fragments beneath its surface. Only the memories remained, memories of fire streaking across the sky, of courage and desperation, of victory and ruin. It was a silence heavy with meaning, the kind of silence that follows only the most decisive of battles. And so the legend of the Zero ended not with a single duel or a gradual decline, but with one thunderous assault that erased its supremacy in the span of a few hours. Hundreds destroyed, countless pilots lost, and a reputation reduced to ashes. For Japan, it was a wound that could never heal. For America, it was a triumph that symbolized the inevitable march toward victory. For history, it was the moment when the skies themselves bore witness to the fall of a legend. The Zero had once soared as a predator unmatched, feared by every enemy it faced. But on this day, beneath the blazing sun and over the endless ocean, it was overwhelmed, crushed beneath the relentless power of a nation that refused to yield. What remained was not just wreckage in the sea, but a story etched forever in memory. A story of dominance claimed, of legends broken, and of the day when the Pacific skies belonged to the United States.